Hello and welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Haunting of Arreton House. Holly Arnold was one of those real estate agents whose polished charm and relentless drive could sell a shack in the middle of the moors to a king. She was young, ambitious, and eager to make her mark in the cutthroat world of luxury property. That's why, when Arreton House came on the market, Holly jumped at the chance. Located on the Isle of Wight, Arreton House was a sprawling, isolated mansion with a breathtaking view of the sea. Its dark stone walls stood tall against the windswept cliffs, and the overgrown gardens, though wild, hinted at past grandeur. The house had been on the market for years, and the previous agent had long since given up on it. Holly saw opportunity where others saw failure. As she drove up the long, winding driveway for the first time, Holly marveled at the mansion's imposing silhouette. She imagined the types of clients who would be drawn to such a property: eccentric millionaires, reclusive artists, maybe even the odd celebrity looking for privacy. She was already crafting her sales pitch in her mind, envisioning how she would describe the house's rich history and untapped potential. What she didn't know was that Arreton House had a history far darker than she could ever have imagined. The first visit was uneventful, if not slightly unsettling. The house had been empty for years, and the air inside was stale, with a faint, musty odor that clung to the back of her throat. Dust coated every surface, and the rooms were filled with the silence of abandonment. As she wandered from room to room, Holly noticed odd details: deep scratches in the wood of the doors, a cracked mirror in an upstairs bedroom, and, most disturbingly, a patch of discolored wallpaper in the hallway that looked strangely like dried blood. Shaking off the feeling of unease, Holly snapped pictures of the rooms with her phone, making mental notes of how she would stage the place for prospective buyers. She paused when she reached the grand staircase, its banister ornately carved with twisted, serpentine figures. The steps creaked under her weight, but she continued upward, eager to see the upper floors. As she reached the landing, she felt a sudden chill. The temperature in the hallway was several degrees colder than the rest of the house. Holly rubbed her arms, glancing around for a draft, but the windows were sealed tight. At the far end of the corridor, she noticed a door slightly ajar. It wasn't listed on the floor plan she'd received. Curiosity piqued, she approached the door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, with low ceilings and a single window that let in only a sliver of grey light. The walls were covered in a faded floral pattern, and in the center of the room was an old, dusty crib. Holly felt a pang of sadness. This must have been a nursery. But as she stepped closer, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Inside the crib, half buried in dust, was a tiny, yellowed bone. Her breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, knocking over a rusted toy soldier that clattered loudly to the floor. The noise echoed through the empty house, startling Holly into a full retreat. She practically ran down the stairs and out the front door, slamming it behind her. Outside, in the daylight, the experience seemed almost ridiculous. A bone? It was probably just a piece of an old toy or some animal that had found its way inside over the years. But Holly couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. She told herself it was just the atmosphere of the place. Anyone would be spooked in an old, abandoned mansion like this. But as she drove away, she couldn't help but glance back at the house in her rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone or something watching her from the windows. Determined not to let her nerves get the best of her, Holly threw herself into her work. She had the house cleaned, the gardens trimmed, and the interior staged with elegant furniture that evoked the mansion's historical charm. She even commissioned a glossy brochure that highlighted the mansion's Gothic allure and timeless beauty. The first open house was a success, at least on the surface. Several potential buyers showed interest, including a wealthy couple from London who seemed particularly taken with the idea of restoring the property to its former glory. Holly was thrilled, but she couldn't ignore the strange occurrences that had started plaguing her since that first visit. It began with nightmares. Holly would wake in the middle of the night, heart pounding, with images of Arreton House burned into her mind. She dreamed of dark hallways and shadowy figures lurking just out of sight. Sometimes she saw a child, a little girl with long, dark hair and hollow eyes, standing at the foot of her bed, staring at her in silence. Holly would wake up drenched in sweat, the girl's image seared into her memory. But it wasn't just the nightmares. Holly began to notice odd things happening during her waking hours as well. She would hear whispers when she was alone, soft and indistinct, like the sound of someone speaking just out of earshot. Her phone would ring, and when she answered, there would be nothing but static on the other end. She started seeing fleeting movements in her peripheral vision, shadows that would dart out of sight as soon as she turned her head. Despite these disturbances, Holly refused to let her fear get the better of her. She was too close to sealing the deal on Arreton house, and the commission from the sale would be her biggest yet. She had to push through. Then, one evening, she received a call from the London couple. They wanted to meet at the house to discuss the final details of the sale. Holly agreed, relieved that the end was in sight. But as she hung up the phone, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When she arrived at Arreton house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the property. The house loomed before her, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes staring down at her. Holly took a deep breath and forced herself to walk up to the front door. As she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated, her hand trembling. Something was telling her not to go inside, but she ignored the warning. The interior of the house was eerily quiet, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet. She called out, but there was no answer. The couple was supposed to be here already, but the house was empty. Holly checked her phone, no missed calls, no messages. Unease gnawed at her as she made her way through the dimly lit rooms. When she reached the grand staircase, she stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. The door at the end of the upstairs hallway was open again. The door to the nursery. Holly felt an overwhelming urge to turn around and leave, but something compelled her to move forward. She climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the landing, she paused, listening. The house was still silent, but the cold she had felt earlier was back, more intense this time, seeping into her bones. She walked down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. As she approached the open door, she noticed something strange. The wallpaper in the hallway was peeling, revealing what looked like letters written beneath. Holly leaned in closer, her breath fogging in the cold air. The letters were faint, but she could just make them out. "Help you." As Holly recoiled, her heart racing. She stumbled back, and as she did, the door to the nursery creaked open wider, as if inviting her in. A soft, childlike giggle echoed from inside the room. Trembling, Holly stepped into the nursery. The crib was still there, the bones still lying in the dust. But now, the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of something scuttling across the floor. Holly spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but she saw nothing. The room was empty, yet she could feel a presence, something malevolent watching her, waiting. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang. Holly screamed and rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pounded on the door, her screams echoing through the house. Then she heard it, a soft, scratching sound coming from inside the walls. It started in the corner of the room and slowly moved closer, the sound growing louder and more frantic. Holly backed away from the wall, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. The wallpaper near the crib began to bulge, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. Holly's eyes widened in horror as the bulge grew larger, the sound of scratching becoming more frantic. Then, with a sickening tear, the wallpaper split open, and a small, skeletal hand emerged, clawing its way out of the wall. Holly screamed, stumbling back into the crib. The hand was followed by an arm, then another, and soon the wall was splitting open, revealing a mass of writhing, skeletal children, their hollow eyes fixed on her. They crawled out of the wall, their bones clicking and scraping against each other, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. Holly was paralyzed with fear, her back pressed against the crib, unable to look away from the grotesque scene unfolding before her. The children, or what was left of them, dragged themselves toward her, their bony fingers scratching across the floor. Their eyes empty, dark voids seemed to bore into her soul, filling her with a deep, suffocating terror. As they drew closer, the air in the room grew colder, the chill so intense that Holly could see her breath forming in short, panicked bursts. The children moved slowly, methodically, as if they were savoring the fear they elicited from her. Their skeletal forms, covered in ragged, decayed remnants of clothing, creaked and groaned with every movement. Holly's mind raced, searching for a way out, but the door remained firmly shut, the handle moving under her frantic grip. She turned back to the children, now mere feet away, and her breath hitched as she realized that they were whispering. The sound was faint at first, a soft chorus of indistinct voices, but it grew louder, more insistent. "Help us, find us, free us." The whispers blended together in a cacophony of despair, their voices rising and falling in a haunting, mournful melody. Holly covered her ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside her head, echoing in her thoughts. Desperate, she backed up further, pressing herself against the cold, stone wall. But as she did, she felt something move behind her. She spun around, only to see that the walls themselves were alive, shifting and pulsating as if they were made of flesh. The stone was no longer cold but warm, almost like living skin, and it undulated beneath her touch. The room was closing in on her, the walls contracting and the ceiling lowering, as though the house itself was trying to consume her. The children's whispers became screams, their voices filled with agony and rage. Holly's heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the suffocating weight of the house bearing down on her as if it were feeding on her fear. Then, in a moment of blind panic, Holly remembered the window. She turned toward it, the only source of light in the room, and bolted toward it with every ounce of strength she had left. But as she reached the window, she found it sealed shut, the glass thick and unyielding. The children were closing in, their skeletal hands reaching up for her, their touch cold and deadly. Holly pounded on the glass with her fists, screaming for help, but there was no one to hear her. Outside, the world seemed impossibly far away, the sea in the distance a cruel reminder of freedom that she could never reach. Just as the first of the children's hands touched her ankle, Holly felt a surge of adrenaline. In one last, desperate act, she grabbed a heavy iron candlestick from a nearby table and smashed it against the window with all her might. The glass shattered, shards raining down around her, and for a brief moment she felt the rush of hope. Without hesitating, she climbed up onto the windowsill and looked down. The drop was steep, a sheer drop onto the jagged rocks below, but she knew she had no other choice. Behind her, the children were closing in, their bony fingers brushing against her legs, their whispers now a deafening roar in her ears. With a final scream, Holly pushed herself through the broken window and leaped into the night. She fell for what felt like an eternity, the wind rushing past her, the dark waves below growing closer. But as she neared the rocks, everything went black. Holly awoke to the sound of waves crashing against the shore. She was lying on her back, the sky above her a dull gray. Pain radiated through her body, and she winced as she tried to move. Her clothes were torn and soaked with seawater, and she could feel the sharp sting of cuts on her skin. She was alive. Somehow she had survived the fall. Gritting her teeth, Holly pushed herself up, her vision swimming. She was on a narrow strip of beach, the cliffs of Arreton house towering above her. The mansion itself loomed at the edge of the cliff, its dark silhouette a stark contrast against the sky. The house looked unchanged, as if nothing had happened, as if it were still waiting, watching. Holly shivered, the memory of the children still fresh in her mind. She knew she couldn't stay here. She had to get away from this place, as far away as possible. But as she staggered to her feet, something caught her eye, something half buried in the sand. She hesitated, then bent down, wincing at the pain in her side. It was a small wooden box, worn and weathered by the elements. Curiosity, or perhaps something more, compelled her to open it. Inside, she found a bundle of letters, yellow with age and tied with a frayed ribbon. The writing was faded, but still legible. Holly's hands trembled as she read the first letter, her breath catching in her throat. The letters were from a woman named Eleanor, the wife of the original owner of Arreton House. She wrote of her husband's descent into madness, how he became obsessed with the house, convinced that it was alive, that it spoke to him in whispers. He had built the nursery for their daughter, but after she died in a tragic accident, he had locked himself away in the house, refusing to leave. Aline's letter spoke of strange occurrences, of voices in the walls, of shadows that moved on their own. She wrote of the children, the lost souls trapped within the house, who whispered to her at night, begging to be freed. She begged for someone to come to help her escape, but the letters ended abruptly, with no indication of what had become of her. Holly's heart pounded as she read the final letter, the ink smudged and hurried. Asterisk, the house knows we want to leave, it won't let us, it's hungry, it feeds on us, on our fear, on our souls. I can hear them, the children, they want to be free, but they are bound to this place, just as we are. I fear it's too late for us, but if someone finds this, please burn the house, burn it to the ground and set us free. The asterisk, Holly's blood ran cold as she realized the truth. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a predator, a malevolent entity that consumed the souls of its occupants, trapping them within its walls for eternity. She knew what she had to do. She had to destroy Arreton house to put an end to the horror that had claimed so many lives. With renewed determination, Holly staggered up the beach, her mind racing. She needed to find help, to gather what she could to burn the house down. But as she reached the edge of the cliff, she froze. Standing at the top, silhouetted against the sky, was a figure. A tall, dark figure, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was the man from Aline's letters, the original owner of Arreton house. He stared down at Holly, a twisted smile on his lips, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force. "Yet you can't escape," he said, his voice low. "You belong to the house now, just like the others." Holly's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away. The cliff edge was too steep, the rocks below too jagged. "Yet you will return," the man continued. "The house always calls its own back." Holly shook her head. But as she looked into the man's glowing eyes, she felt a pull, a deep, irresistible pull drawing her back toward the house. She turned and ran, her feet slipping on the wet rocks, but the pull grew stronger with every step. The whispers returned, louder this time, more insistent, and she could feel the house's malevolent presence wrapping around her, pulling her back. She reached the base of the cliff, panting and out of breath, her body aching with every movement. But as she looked up, she saw the house looming above her, and she knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The house had claimed her, just as it had claimed the others. And as the darkness closed in around her, Holly knew that she would never leave Arreton house. Not alive. Months later, Arreton house was back on the market. The listing described it as a majestic, historic mansion with stunning sea views and immense potential. The brochure made no mention of its past or the disappearance of Holly Arnold, who was last seen driving toward the Isle of Wight. The house remained empty, waiting for its next victim. For it knew, sooner or later, someone would come. They always did. And Arreton house would be ready to welcome them home. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had or have a great day.